American democracy is under threat, and we all need to work together to protect the country and to protect our democracy. It's kind of like in World War II, when everyone was expected to play a role. And the first part of this is for all of us to learn a little more and to work together, strengthening American democracy, strengthening the country. The Civic Life series is a big part of that, and the 92nd Street Y, New York, is the right forum for delivering all that. I appreciate your joining me. Thanks.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 92nd Street Y and the Craig Newmark Pro-Democracy series. I'm Tom Nichols from The Atlantic magazine. And of course, I'm talking today with my friend and colleague, Lindsay Chervinsky, about her new book on John Adams and the precedents that created the modern American presidency. And so I think we're going to have a lively discussion, yes, about John Adams, of all people. Lindsay, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Good to see you. I think John Adams is the perfect person for a lively conversation. And if he were here, he would have certainly been lively too. So we will keep up to his spirit.
Well, as you know, I am a son of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So I've always had this kind of warm place in my heart for Mr. Adams. I also tend to be a somewhat blustery and obnoxious character. So ever since the movie 1776, I've always felt like maybe he was my favorite founder. But I wanted to talk to you not just about Adams's character, which just shines through in this book, but also this interesting choice you've made. Because we talk about, when we talk about John Adams, when we talk about the the earlier biographies and the Paul Giamatti series and the popularization of John Adams, it still is very focused on that he is obnoxious and disliked. And yet this really fills a gap in people's, at least in my understanding, of what he actually did. We lionize Washington for being willing to walk away from power, but John Adams is the first guy who does it because he actually loses. I think in this day and age, being willing to accept a loss in a presidential election, seems to matter. So let me throw the obvious author question at you. Why this book? Why John Adams? Why in this way? Because it's so interesting to talk about Adams as the presidency that really does kind of create the precedents rather than giving those laurels, say, to George Washington.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for being here. I've said this to you before, but I'm a really big fan of all of your work. And so this is just such a treat for me to be able to talk history with you. But I think in terms of John Adams, I finished my first book, The Cabinet, on the creation of this institution by Washington. And then I started thinking about what happens next. Like, once Washington leaves, he was such a unique figure in American history. There was just this real question of, did any of the stuff that he did, would any of that work for anyone else? And so I initially conceived of a book that explored John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's cabinets. And I started writing it, and I realized very quickly that I did not want to write the Jefferson part. And so I cut that off, which partly because I felt like I had...
Is it a thing that the more you learn about Washington and Adams, the kind of the less you start to like Thomas Jefferson? It feels, I have great respect for Mr. Jefferson, but
yeah,
he does always seem to...
Yeah, that's just it. So I think it's impossible to study this period and not come away with respect for him. The amount that he shaped the early American Republic is just maybe unparalleled if we're looking at like the time frame from 1775 to 1825. But he's not always very likable, and he's not always very relatable by design. He doesn't want to be relatable. And John Adams does not have that problem. And so, I was studying John Adams' presidency, and I was doing this research, and then January 6th happened. And it completely changed the way that I saw John Adams' presidency. It completely unlocked the actions he took, because I was looking for the small things he did to make sure the peaceful transfer of power actually worked. And I think that most of the great biographers of John Adams, they're phenomenal books. I mean, one, when you're writing about a life that's as long and as extraordinary as John Adams, it's going to be hard to cover everything. But they also hadn't lived through that transition. And so, like most people, I think they probably took for granted how precious and how fragile the peaceful transfer of power was. I certainly took that for granted. And it wasn't until I saw what happens when it doesn't happen that I actually was looking for the things and asking the questions about, what did John Adams do to preserve the presidency? And I think so much of at least my work is shaped by what questions I'm asking. And so that was my approach. And then as I started writing it, these elements that he contributed to the presidency to make sure that it survived for people that followed really opened up and kind of unfolded once I was looking at that angle.
I think it's something that happened to a lot of us who were writing about democracy, whether in 1800 or now. I was writing a book about modern American democracy when January 6th happened, and I had the same. It had the same impact on me that it did on you, where I found myself just stopping what I was writing and saying, did this really just happen? You know, have we really failed for the first time in over 2 centuries to peacefully transfer power? And I think having, as you know, I've been doing some work on Washington, but the more work I do on Washington, the more I think that the transition that matters is the one that you decided to study, that to say that, you know, it's majestic that George Washington says, I'm not a king. I'm not staying forever. I'm not going to, you know, be a Caesar but that's easy to say when people are asking you to do it. It's right. I mean, it's, you know, that's the, no, please, you know, it's kind of the, please have one more helping of caviar, you know, no, I couldn't possibly. But for John Adams, who was so irascible and so vain and so difficult, to still have that level of stoicism is really something. So let's dive in. I mean, the title of your book is John Adams and Precedents That Forged the Republic. What are the most important ones? What are those precedents? What are we missing when we think about John Adams that I mean, I've read the book, so I know what we've captured, but why don't you tell us?
Yeah. So I think there are 3. So the first is he showed up, and that doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but he knew, and everyone knew at the time, that whoever came after Washington was going to have a terrible time because they were going to fall short in any comparison to him, and they only had one model to follow. So if they diverged from what Washington had done, they were going to be criticized for it. And if they followed what he did, they were going to be criticized for it. And he did it anyway. And I think that irascibility that you mentioned was really what allowed him to do so, because he didn't mind being unpopular if he felt like he was doing what was right, which I think is another way of saying political courage. But it took a very special person who was stubborn enough and independently minded enough to know that that was the stakes of the game and to do it anyway. The second big one is he defended executive power from a variety of different threats, whether they came from Congress, whether they came from the cabinet, whether they came from international nations. And he reaffirmed the president's right to declare what diplomacy was, to declare foreign policy, to pursue treaties. He reaffirmed the president's right over the cabinet. He was the first president to fire a secretary, which was really an untested thing. Washington had never done that. And so that power was quite theoretical. And so when we think about the shape of the executive branch and how it looks and how much authority the president has, it really goes back to Adams because, again, Washington was so unquestioned in his authority that it didn't apply to anybody else. The third one, and we touched a little,
point, I'm sorry to interrupt, but didn't Congress at one point in Washington's administration, again, this is the thing you're talking about with notional versus somebody actually had to do it. Congress wanted some kind of power about firing, right? They wanted to not just to consent, but to have to be consulted when firing. And Washington, and of course Adams is his vice president, that gets pushed back. But it doesn't get as you say, it doesn't get tested. Right? I
Well,
mean,
this is,
Washington could
yeah.
have said, well, I'm not going to do it. And people would have said, well, okay.
This is one of those great moments where the Constitution is really just the starting point. And so if we think about, the Constitution as like this holy object, it totally misses how it actually unfolded over time. So the Constitution says department secretaries, but it doesn't say what they are, what they do, what departments they are, how they're removed, et cetera, et cetera. The first federal Congress created the first three departments in the Attorney General and established that the president does appoint them, but they couldn't come to an agreement about how they were to be removed. And so they were under the gun because of the timing. And so they basically used passive voice and punted and said that when a secretary is removed, the chief clerk becomes in charge of the documents,
That's why
acknowledging
I
that
always
like
tell my students never to use the passive voice. If any of you out
it's
there are writers, this is why the
it's
passive
very
voice is so
sneaky.
evil.
It's
Mistakes were
very
made.
sneaky.
Yeah.
Yes. So there's like this acknowledgement that removal can happen, but it's not clear who can do it and what role the Senate might have. And so when John Adams fired Timothy Pickering in May of 1800, the Senate could have pushed back, could have demanded approval. And instead, they basically approved his replacement, John Marshall, which hard to reject John Marshall, but they approved his replacement, and that established the precedent that this is how it was going to work. And with very few exceptions, most notably Andrew Johnson, that has basically been what has happened over the course of American history.
Okay, I'm sorry. There were other
Yes, the
precedents.
third one that we talked about a little bit already is the peaceful transfer of power. So his presidency was bookended by the first two transitions. And the transition of 1800 does overshadow the one in 1796 because of the change of political parties. But that to me is reading history a little bit backwards. And for them, living through this moment as it actually unfolded, 1796 to 1797 was just as important as 1800 to 1801 because they were living in the age of Napoleon and people didn't step down and go away and then come in a peaceful way. And so to live through those two things, to craft this tradition from scratch when it hadn't been done before, it required great intention by both participants. And that's the piece that I think sometimes gets missed.
It's interesting that you say that because it's when we study early American history, it's so easy to forget what's actually going on. I taught for years at the Naval War College, and especially Army officers, because George Washington and the Army, and the early days of the Republic, and the shores of Tripoli for the Navy and the Marines and so on. And they say things like, "Well, of course we were going to win the revolution. We were the better. We were the It's like, that the British were busy, right?"
They were doing some other things.
my favorite moment in a seminar is when an Army officer said, "Well, of course we were going to win the revolution. What would it have even looked like if we didn't?" And there was this silence in the room, and another officer leaned over and said, "Canada?" It's like, oh yeah, this could have gone bad. So that I want to come back to that stubbornness that you mentioned with that. Again, I should probably fess up and say I'm not from Boston. But I'm from Western Massachusetts. But you grow up with the presidents. Massachusetts, very proud of our presidents. But it's almost like everything that you admire about John Adams can get him into trouble, especially when everything is going to be precedent.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
Yes.
if everything you're doing is precedent, and really for those first 3, 4, 5 presidents, I mean, for every president to some extent, how does that stubbornness, give us an example of when that works to his favor, but also there are a couple of moments I think here where it definitely undermines him and causes him problems.
Yeah. Well, it's so hard because so many of the characteristics that we need our presidents to have, as you said, they can also be problematic. So, for example, we need presidents to have a little bit of an ego. They need to believe that they are the right person to be making these very difficult decisions. But ego can obviously, of course, go in different directions. And I think Adams' stubbornness is a great example of that. So,
Can I interrupt you and ask you, do you think Adams had a big, I think of him as vain in a way, which of course is strange because he's not an attractive human being, right? I mean, he's not Washington, 6'2", good look, he's kind of well, he's him. Do you think is it a big ego? I mean, is he
I don't,
egotistical, or I
yeah,
could
I
never get
mean,
a handle on that.
I think it's more of like he had tremendous confidence in the things that he knew that he knew. So he
Hmm.
had really had a very deep study of constitutional systems and he knew them very well. And he drafted the Massachusetts State Constitution, which, fun trivia fact, is the longest written surviving constitution in the world. And
Is that
had
right?
written
The
his
Massachusetts
defenses.
Constitution?
Yeah.
Oh, more bragging rights for the Commonwealth. I'll be keeping.
And he had written his, of course, defenses of the Constitution, which admittedly is not a huge page turner, but a lot of learning went into that. He was also very, I would almost say, defensive of his foreign policy knowledge that had been hard earned. I mean, very few people at the time had been in as many places as he had been and had as keen a sense and understanding of how foreign nations actually worked. He understood that they were self-interested, and that was really important to his view of the world. And I think he was right in that. So when people challenged that, in particular when Alexander Hamilton challenged that, he could become very, it looked like it was egotistical, but I don't actually think, I think you're right that it's not actually ego. It's more of like a vanity about experience and a vanity about his own abilities and how hard he had to work to earn them, and then was very stubborn when he felt he was right about those things. So pursuing diplomacy was the big one. He, over time, began to accumulate information from various different sources in Europe that France really didn't want war. And that was totally consistent with his view of the world. Why would France want war with them? To your point, they were also very busy. And, including the United States in the global war was not in their best interest. So he began to pursue that diplomacy and was willing to split his party and willing to really threaten his election chances to pursue what he felt was right. And that stubbornness there was, I think, quite important. At times, it did undermine his ability to govern effectively because he didn't really always want to be in Philadelphia or wherever the seat of government had to be located at various moments. He wanted to be home and he wanted to be with Abigail, which, as a bit of a homebody, I do admittedly understand. But when you're president, you don't really have that luxury. He sometimes, I think, refused to see maybe some of the plots that were taking place in front of him, or maybe he just didn't want to see them. So he could be sort of willfully blind. And I think that stubbornness does come into play there.
That's interesting about the plots, because one of the things that strikes me about that whole first part of the Republic, aside from the fact that there are huge dramas going on in Europe that we just kind of forget about. And I think the problem is, too, if you study European history, and you sort of wallow into Napoleon and the age of Napoleon, you can sort of forget, oh, yeah, there's actually this new power developing across the ocean. But one of the things that strikes me in that entire period is that they are all revolutionary comrades in arms.
Mm.
And then they
Mm-hmm.
start becoming horrible to each other.
Yeah.
I mean, that there's a heartbreak, especially in the Adams story. I mean, Washington, right, doesn't he's like Adams. He doesn't want to see it. He goes home, and 2 years later, he passes away. Adams and Jefferson, I mean, it's such a fraught relationship. And I think that stubbornness, well, as you were describing it, I wonder if maybe it's a stubbornness that they all had, that if they knew they were right about something, if they thought that their moral compass was true, then they didn't really they trusted that got them through the revolution, right?
Yeah.
When everybody's telling them you're going to hang for this, and this is a sin.
Yeah.
And Adams, more than any of them, seems to be the one who kind of grasps the I don't want to say the street fighting essence of it, but I keep contrasting him to the presidents before and after him. Washington's not a big thinker.
Yeah.
Jefferson's a huge thinker. That's all he does. And Adams is the guy who's kind of scrappy, and just understands that this isn't, I mean, is there an 18th century equivalent for the expression "politics ain't beanbag"? I mean, he kind of gets what they're doing. I also want to ask a very hackneyed kind of question, because it's always an interesting answer. And you and I have had this discussion in other venues. That stubbornness, that force of character, that moral compass,
Mhm.
what's the best decision that leads him to in terms of establishing the kind of precedents you're talking about in this book?
Mhm.
And of course, we're probably going to all agree on the worst, right? We'll get to Alien Sedition Act and
Yeah.
all that creepy stuff.
Yeah.
What's the best? Where does that serve him well? That does the most important thing in terms of one of the best decisions for the future of America.
Well, I want me to circle back to your idea about this infighting. And I think what happened was during the revolution, they had an external enemy that they could fight. And even though they had a lot of disagreements internally, it was very clear what the external enemy was because it was an army marching towards them and a navy. And so there's not a whole lot of question about like what is the threat to the republic when it's so crystal in your mind. Afterward, they all saw threats to the future of the republic. They just disagreed on what those threats were. And so they started to see each other as mortal threats, and they couldn't find one thing to unify around. And I think to a certain extent, we saw a parallel of that happen because, during the Cold War at various moments, the enemy was very clear. And this is where I'm, tiptoeing into your territory.
I was thinking
so
of the
correct me if
Cold
I'm
War as
wrong.
you were talking.
Yeah, it's, there's a very
Are you
clear
saying that
enemy.
democracies, when they lack an external threat, fall into fighting among themselves? This
Well,
sounds
and
awful familiar.
Yeah, and I wonder if, the rise of, not that we haven't been in moments of very intense partisanship before, certainly the 1790s is one of them, but sort of the increase in the most recent trend, which most people, push around around the 1990s, early 2000s, the rise of Newt Gingrich, things like that, coincides with the lack of external enemy. And so I think that it may be um, a feature, not a bug to the American system.
Or just a cyclical problem that democracies that once you've sort of attained, I mean, this not that we're going to go down the road of big think, but Nietzsche, Hoffer, Fukuyama, I mean, I think that there is some of that. But it's especially painful to watch it with men who have pledged their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor together,
And we're
questioning
friends.
each other's sacred honor.
Yeah. Yeah. And they were friends and they worked together and they were close and they pursued the same goals. But so to answer your question about the stubbornness. So, I mean, I think overall lifetime wise, the best decision he ever made, of course, was Abigail. But in terms of the presidency, the stubbornness was he did not see himself as a Federalist first. He saw himself as the president or as an American. And so his willingness, his stubbornness against his own party, against the radical faction in his own party, and it came up time and time again. It came up with diplomacy. It came up with executive power. It came up
Tell us a bit about, for folks who may not be familiar, tell us about what it means to be the most radical faction of the Federalists.
Yes. So the Federalist Party was initially conceived as the pro-Constitution Party, which was obviously quite a large tent. And so it encompassed everyone who basically believed that there needed to be a stronger government in order for the United States to survive. And Washington eventually became nominally a Federalist, but really the big figureheads, the big leaders in terms of intellectually were people like Alexander Hamilton. And within Adams' administration, Timothy Pickering, who was the Secretary of State, was a very intense, what I call an arch Federalist. They're also sometimes called high Federalists. One of the nicknames for this group was the Essex Junto, which I think is pretty funny. So anyway, there was this like section of the Federalist Party that was much more extreme. They wanted to have a strong standing army all the time. They wanted to pursue war with France. They wanted to use said army for domestic purposes and sometimes for political purposes. They were very in favor of the Sedition Acts. They distrusted immigrants. They were very extreme. And on some things, Adams agreed with them, but on a lot he didn't. And as they became increasingly more radical, he started to realize that they saw the Republicans, and this is the Jeffersonian Republicans, not to be confused with the Lincoln Republicans or the Republicans of today. The Jeffersonian Republicans, they saw them as such a mortal threat that they were willing to do anything to destroy them. And he realized that was actually not the point. The point was to preserve the Republic, not to destroy the Republicans. And so at various moments, he was willing to split with them and be quite stubborn about it. And I think it was essential.
And the Jeffersonian Republicans in that time still thinking in a way, we don't want to overdraw the parallel by the time we get to the Civil War, but still thinking about the states are the
Mhm.
real source of sovereignty and power, and that the federal
Yes.
government is this kind of necessary but should be
Yes.
weak kind of right. So
They also tended to be a little bit more aligned with, like, they ideologically were more aligned with France. They tended to have more support among the
with
farmers
revolutionary
and the
France,
working classes. Yes, yes, revolutionary
right,
France.
right.
They tended to find more support in like the Western regions. So they were also split geographically and over their interests in terms of how they wanted the government to invest in things, like which type of citizens they thought were the proper citizens for governments to back.
And it's a fair, I don't want to get too far away from Adams, but it's a fair, again, for folks that are listening, fair to say the Federalists tended to be somewhat more of a looking toward the cities and commerce, and that the Jeffersonians were more about the agrarian ideal, and every man's homestead a castle, and
Yeah.
all that sort of pastoral sort of America. I mean, in a way, you can see North and South congealing into these two camps early on.
Yeah,
And
they're definitely starting to do that. It's but you're right, it's also like an east-west divide, and it's also it can be a bit of a class divide
Mhm.
because but it's also complicated because there were a lot of wealthy Southerners who were Jeffersonian Republicans, but then there were some plantation owners in South Carolina in particular that were Federalists. So it was a little bit messy. One rule of thumb, however, that I do think is helpful is not every Federalist was an officer in the Continental Army, but almost every officer became a Federalist.
Uh, um, and right, and there was some controversy about that toward the end of Washington's term and going into Adams's
Mm.
term about the loyalty of the army, and it's amazing how much in this book uh, does raise the kind of anxieties we're living through right now. And if you did that intentionally, I say bravo. And if you didn't, it's just terrifying that history sort of, rhymes.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I wanted the I did not intentionally draw the connections for I intentionally did not draw the connections for people because I want the book to stand the test of time and to feel like it's of a political moment. But I also wasn't trying to hide it. And so
right.
I hoped that those parallels would come through.
Well, I mean, it's there, and it's something that just comes out just by telling the story.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about let's now go to the fun part of always talking about Mr. Adams. Um, but I want to start by going back to something you just said about class. It's you think of John Adams and you think, the popular culture is that, Harvard, of course, and Boston and shopkeepers. And yet Adams is not really, he's not really an elite, is he? I mean, he's not like a lot of the guys in Philadelphia in
Yeah.
this period. And
Yeah.
as you keep
He
saying,
is,
he wants to go back to, he doesn't want to be in Philadelphia. He wants to be in
yeah.
Quincy shoveling horse poop and planting
Yeah.
stuff.
Planting carrots. He is what we would consider to be a sort of a New England elite. Like, he's not New England wealthy because those were the merchants like John
Right.
Hancock that had a lot of money. But he is New England aristocracy in that he has the lineage and Harvard, and his wife's family comes from a Puritan family. So there's the New England elite versus the rest of the elite. But you're right that I think in terms of that class piece, it is important because he was never super wealthy. And in fact, most of the money they had, it was because Abigail was a totally brilliant speculator during the war and then during the Confederation period, which maybe was not so great, but she was really good at it. And she was the one that was trying to make more risky investments so that they would have funds. And so he was, I mean, like when they were thinking about trying to expand their house, he had to think about, do I have the funds to do that? He was very limited in that way. And that changed how he thought about the presidency because he didn't have dozens of enslaved people to bring to work the house. And he didn't have money that he could use to buy a bunch of new stuff. And so his approach to socializing, to the president's house, to everything was quite different than everyone else's, but also it shaped his policy. I mean, he was so ardently pro-Navy because he came from the heart of, naval experience. The wood comes from New England. The ships are made in New England. The sailors come from New England. The merchants are in New England. So he knew the value of the Navy, and he wanted it from the very beginning.
And he didn't profit from the war as some of the other people of his time did. I mean, you know, when wars happen, there are some people always get rich.
Yeah.
So I want to come back to Abigail, and maybe we'll finish up with her, finish this discussion up with her, because she's so interesting, and she is so beautifully present in this book. But you know, let's get to the ugly stuff. So
Yeah.
what he sets all these precedents. He, you know, helps to forge a republic. How bad were the screw-ups?
Yeah, they're not small. So there are 4 bills that are included in what we think of as the Alien and Sedition Acts, and it's important to sort of separate them because some are like genuinely well-intentioned and some are terrible. So there's the Alien Enemy Act, which was basically a wartime act, which said that if the United States is declared war on a nation, then foreign nationals from that nation can be removed with appropriate due process. We've had a bill like that on the books since then. It has been used in periods of wartime. It's like, I think, a totally appropriate war measure as long as due process is available. So the Republicans actually had spearheaded that because they were trying to stave off more radical measures, which did not work. Because then the Federalists in Congress passed the Alien Friends Act, which basically said that the president can remove at will any foreign national without appropriate due process, and there doesn't have to be a declaration of war. So that bill was passed. Adams did sign it, but critically, he never actually invoked it. So he didn't deport anyone. So I think that one, while he probably shouldn't have signed it, he also didn't ever use it, and it never really went into effect. So we can kind of put that into, I think, a separate category.
Was it ever?
There's then the what? Sorry.
Was that repealed? Was that one?
It was. It had.
I guess I'm asking because I want to know if that one's still on the books.
That one is not still on the books. That one had an expiration date, and so the Alien War Act has been re-upped time and time again, whereas the Alien Friends Act expired. The Naturalization Act made it much harder for immigrants to become citizens by design because immigrants tended to vote for Republicans. So that was purely political. The Federalists in Congress passed it. It should be noted, Adams asked for none of this legislation. So he was not like whipping votes. He had not proposed it, but he did sign all of them. He also signed the Naturalization Act. The last one, and this is really the one where we have to dig in, is the Sedition Act. And it is important to note for context that at the time, there was not the type of legislation or jurisprudence that we have on the books today that protects against certain types of speech. So the most famous is, of course, you're not allowed to shout fire in a crowded theater. You don't have a right to speech that invokes violence. Those protections did not exist, and a lot of newspaper editors were actually invoking violence in their newspapers, and there was violence on the streets. So there was both a very good faith basis to be worried about the type of violence that was produced by political speech, and also this bill was totally partisan in its intent because it protected the president and Congress from criticism, basically, and notably left out the vice president, which was Thomas Jefferson. And it expired the last day of Adams' presidency. So it's really bad.
That's almost a kind of that's got a real sort of Putin's Kremlin feel about it, doesn't it? You know, criticizing the president and
it's, you know, I mean, it was very clearly designed to be political because once it was passed, Timothy Pickering, who again was this very extreme Federalist, was in charge of basically overseeing the prosecutions, and he did so with enthusiasm. His personality was really best suited for the Spanish Inquisition rather than a republic. And he brought these prosecutions, and Adams, while he didn't ask for them, he approved of them. And all of the people who were prosecuted were Republicans. And although there were things in the law, like truth can be used as a defense against sedition, how do you prove the veracity of a political opinion? It's not actually possible. And the entire judicial system was also stacked with Federalists. So it was a really bad law. And I do think he deserves criticism for it. I think more of the blame belongs to people like Pickering and the Arch Federalists who brought the bill forward, but he didn't do anything to stop it. And that's absolutely a black mark on his record.
Well, and born out of this panic about war with France, that leads to, I think, and I know you and I had a discussion about this a while back, another not grievous error, but a very strange constitutional arrangement where he asks Washington to come back as the commander in chief of the army. He asks a former president to become the supreme commander, almost inviting him to usurp the president's own Article 2 power, which could have been, that could have been really bad, right? I mean, if Washington had been a different person, you know, if the French had actually landed on our shores, I mean, that was a bad idea.
Well, I think it was. I mean, I think it's on one hand, it's really understandable because Adams didn't have any military experience and the Washington was still alive. And so like that particular weird scenario will never really emerge again because of how our nation has evolved. But Washington was still alive. His shadow was like very much looming. And Adams did so in a way to, I think, try and block Hamilton from getting that position because the Federalists had been talking about putting Hamilton in the number one seat. And so on one hand, I get it. Like I understand what the thinking was and the political rationale behind it and why one would do so. And Washington was such a unifying figure that if there was going to be war, it would be very helpful to have his participation to be something the American people could rally around. However, I think a couple of things happened that demonstrated the flaws, as you said. One, Adams got boxed in to basically appointing Hamilton as the number two. And that was mostly the doing of the cabinet and some other arch federalists, but Washington did have a role there. And I think it was one of his worst mistakes in public life that he allowed himself to sort of be pitted against the president in a way that he would have never permitted when he was president. And then you're right. I mean, the army is trying to kind of maneuver and take executive power. And that is an example where I think Adams' stubbornness was useful because he saw what was happening and he saw what the army was doing and how political it was being. And he worked to basically slow play the development of the army and to undermine its growth so that it could not be used as this political force.
Interesting. And with bringing up Hamilton, before we go to Abigail and then kind of close out our discussion, let's spend 30 seconds on political gossip. Why did Adams and Hamilton, what was the problem between them? Because they're both, you would think, in some way, both, you know, Federalists, both coming from a similar understanding of foreign policy, of the role of the Constitution, and yet...
Yeah. And yet they're like oil and water. I think it was really a personality thing. You know, Hamilton was so deferential to Washington because of their unique relationship, but there were very few people he was deferential to otherwise. Otherwise, he usually thought he was the smartest person in the room. And so when he brought that attitude to Adams, given that he had never actually been in a diplomatic position and never actually done any diplomacy, Adams had zero patience for that kind of nonsense. And you know, Adams felt that he deserved respect for his experience, and Hamilton tended to be fairly insecure about his life position. And so when he didn't receive the respect he thought he deserved, that was just a complete clash. And it, I think, was exacerbated by the fact that Hamilton distrusted John Adams because he felt like he couldn't control him. He said he was too independent, which he was. It was an accurate assessment of, you know, of their various positions. So I think they both expected to be the alpha in the room, and that doesn't work when you have to. And
of course, Hamilton, having been around Washington so much, of whom Adams once said he had the gift of silence. Adams, of course, had no such gift in any way.
No.
So, you know, they were men, and in this case, a man who loved a woman, and she is woven into these pages. So talk to us a bit before we kind of wrap up here about the influence of Abigail. I think anyone who's seen the HBO series kind of falls in love with this Laura Linney characterization, but in a way, it doesn't do her justice. I mean, she's even stronger than that, and she's even more involved than that. Than just, you know, being the hearth keeper, holding the rifle and the pitchfork out in, you know, Quincy. So talk to us a bit about her influence and on John as he's forging a republic.
She was, as you said, I mean, she was so much to him because she was both, of course, the mother of their children and his wife, and maintained the home and really was their financial manager and took care of all of the properties. But she also was an absolutely brilliant political mind. And she had such savvy ability to assess exactly what was happening, exactly what people were up to, exactly what their motivations were. I mean, she could just look at someone and see, just completely read their character. And very few people have that ability, have those skills. And hers were all self-taught. She didn't have a lot of higher education, so all of her reading was done on her own. And she could go toe to toe with Adams in terms of the classical references, and they would make jokes based on like Greek and Roman stories. And so she's just this incredible brain, in addition to being a support and a partner in life. And some of Adams' critics referred to her as his cabinet of one, and it's probably the most accurate criticism that has ever been levied against Adams, because he did rely on her first and foremost. And I would say 95% of the time, she led him in the right direction. The one area where perhaps not, she was ardently in favor of the Sedition Acts. And I think partly that was because, I mean, they were getting threats to the president's house about his safety, and she worried desperately in a time before Secret Service or before there were fences outside the president's house, and she was terrified that something would happen to him. And so, like we all are with our own loved ones, we tend to be extra defensive of our loved ones, and so she was of him and wanted the sedition bill to protect him. But usually she gave amazing advice. And so I always, everyone knows the Remember the Ladies letter, and for good reason, because it's brilliant, but it's actually so average in her correspondence because so many of her letters just have these amazing insights about political life, about power, about men, about their weaknesses. And she was such an extraordinary figure.
And it seems almost as if she, in that ability, that intuitive grasp of people, she was better than he was.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think that if they lived today, she would be the politician. I mean, he would, I think, probably want to, but she would be the politician because she just completely, as you said, she was intuitive about it and could see exactly what was happening, and also had just like the most cutting insults too. So she had an ability to just cut people down to size so quickly.
Well, even though, and this is going to sound like a counterintuitive question, even though, we have immortalized John Adams in a musical, and then we have this series with, on HBO, I've still always felt like Adams was overshadowed.
Yeah.
I lived in Washington for years. I don't remember going to the John Adams Memorial.
There is not one.
I don't see him on my $2 bill or $50 bill, or I think there are words. I'm a New Englander. Don't get me started about Andrew Jackson being on our money.
In agreement, 100% in agreement with you.
And so why is it just because he came after Washington? Was it just too soon?
So I think there are a couple of reasons. So the first is he's sandwiched between Washington and Jefferson, which is just not ideal. And obviously he's going to be a little bit overshadowed. Because of the way the political party system evolved, the Federalist Party did eventually disappear basically by the end of the 1820s. But Hamilton was always associated with the Federalist Party because Adams was so independent. And so he didn't really have a constituency or a party that seemed like it was defending him or defending his record. And then the third reason is he was living in the time of two of the greatest propagandists that have ever lived in American history, which were Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. And they were both writing horrible things about him at the very same time. And for some reason, have not totally been able to articulate. Historians, when assessing Hamilton and Jefferson's writings about everyone else, take it with a grain of salt. But when they're writing about Adams, they take it as fact or as an accurate description of what was happening, when in reality, they were both talking about a political rival. And so much of the sort of nasty things that Jefferson and Hamilton were saying while they were competing with Adams have been taken as gospel truth and have, I think, really shaped how we think of him. So much of, like Hamilton talking about him being ungovernable or wild or erratic. And some of that was true, but he also knew that about himself and worked really hard to contain it. And so many of those stories, I think, they cover up the joy and the passion and the happiness and a lot of the spirit that was a central part of who he was, and I think is necessary to understanding him as a full person.
Well, and that comes out of this book. It comes out of some of your other work, which, on the early days of the revolution. It's always struck me as unfair to Mr. Adams. Again, even though we've turned him into something of a cartoon, and it does bother me that he, was, especially with Jefferson, who, as I've gotten older,
Yeah.
I have trouble with someone who's that much a fan of the French Revolution, for one thing. But that,
yeah, he's really good at blocking out the guillotines in his mind's eye.
well, and the enslaved people and the, all of the other things. I mean, Jefferson was a better writer, and so maybe that's the real lesson of history. Be a good writer, you'll get the last word. But John Adams today here gets the last word in this, in just this remarkable book that really does, for anybody who's interested in how our country is created, how it survived, how it went from this idea into being institutionalized. And you're a historian. I'll talk like a political scientist for a moment. How these things became institutionalized and rooted in our culture in a way that I think we've never really given John Adams the credit for, and you finally have. So thank you so much for talking with me about it, and thank you for this book. It's quite an
thank you so much for being here and for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Take care.